Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the International Dialogue. Let's talk about the Ecological Constitution. I am titular Professor Pilar Moraga, Director of the Environmental Law Center, and we are very happy and honored to have the international expert who will talk today about the Chilean constitutional proposal. The Professor Ezio Costa, Deputy Director of Environmental Law Center, will be in charge of guiding the first round table. My best wishes for this day. Welcome.
Many thanks, Pilar, and many thanks to everyone who is here now and who will see this afterwards as well. We have the honor to have three very interesting, very expert professors who will join us today for this conversation. This conversation that, as Pilar said, is about the new Constitution of Chile and specifically about the new Ecological Constitution of Chile. We're thrilled to have you here. Please welcome David Boyd. Hi, David, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, David. David is the Special Rapporteur for Environmental Matters in the United Nations. He's also a very recognized expert on environmental law. Of course, he has written a number of books and publications about environmental law. Thank you, David. We have with us also Michael Berger. Michael is the director of the Sabin Center in the Columbia Law School. Michael is it's probably the biggest expert in the world in climate litigation, and he, of course, has also written a number of things, a number of books and publications on environmental law and specifically climate law. Welcome, Michael, and thank you.
Thank you, Ezio. It's a pleasure to be here.
And our third panelist is the Professor Erin Daly. She will join us in a couple of minutes because she's finishing another event. This is how it works right now. So she will finish that and she will join us. She will be the last one to talk in this event. Professor Daly is a professor in Delaware Law School, Delaware University Law School, and she's the director of the Environmental Law Center there. And she also teaches in the Environmental Law Clinic. So she will be speaking specifically about environmental justice and how the new institutions of the new constitution can help in that matter. Before starting, I want to invite all of you who are watching this to publish with us. We are now with the Environmental Law Journal from Universidad de Chile Law School has a rolling admission of papers. We have a new number in the website right now. It was launched 2 days ago, and we are accepting publications, papers in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and so on. So you are very welcome if you want to join, if you want to read our publication, of course, and if you want to publish with us as well. We are now a Q3 journal, so it's a pretty good journal if you want to put your paper on it. Antonia is telling me that I had to say that this activity will be in English only. If someone didn't know about that, the activity will be in English, as you probably are hearing right now. But anyway, let's start then. I will have a small presentation about the Environmental Constitution, the Ecological Constitution, and then we will have the appreciations and the comments from our guests. So let me share the screen. So yesterday we received, we as the people of Chile, we received the last draft of the new constitution that will be voted for the approval on September the 4th. And this new constitution has a bit of a story about how we reach this text. No, this is especially important for people that are not from Chile, because in Chile we all know the story. But we had big demonstrations in 2019, Estallido Social, or La Revuelta, that's the name that it has in Spanish. And those demonstrations, among other things, because the demonstrations were an accumulation of problems in the way that we are doing things, but one of or two of those problems were environmental justice or injustice, and how the extractive system it's harming water and other commons. These were two of the main issues that were presented by people during these demonstrations. This was especially important in territories that are not Santiago, not the capital, but territories where the environmental injustice it's easier to feel, to live in, no? Especially sacrifice zones and areas of Chile that are that have a lack of water or hydric stress because of climate change, because of the lack of good management of water, and because of privatization of water. So we among the things that were put it into the table in the demonstrations, environmental issues were one of the important ones. After some months of demonstrations and an agreement between political parties, we had a referendum to approve the idea of writing a new constitution. That idea, the idea of writing it, was approved by 78.3% of people, and the idea that the body that had to write it was a constitutional convention, which was opposed with a mixed convention, won by 79% of the voters. The Constitutional Convention had an election as well in 2021. It started to work in July 2021, and the election, from the election, we had an assembly that was 60% of independents, and that worked for 1 year until yesterday. That was the last year in which they showed the result of their work, which is the new constitution that we have to vote in September the 4th. In this constitution, we can find what we have been calling the Ecological Constitution. The new constitution has 388 articles. It's divided in 11 chapters. And one of those chapters is called Environment and Nature. But it's not the only chapter, it's not the only part of the Constitution in which we can find environmental provisions. We actually can find them along all the chapters of the Constitution. There is up to 80 articles where we're still defining how to say this article is connected with environmental issues or not, but at least we can find 80 articles in different chapters that are related with the protection of the environment or the management of the environment. So the Ecological Constitution is this structure of articles that contains the mandate to protect the environment as one of the main objectives of the social organization. And to do this, to actually comply with the mandate of protect the environment, the new constitution built a structure, and this structure has some pillars. So this structure is the Ecological Constitution, and it has at least these 5 pillars, which we will see in the next slides. How are they composed and how they work. But the first pillar is the recognition that we have a relation with nature, that this relation is it's important to us, to our life. It's not only an individual connection, but also a collective connection with nature. That this connection, it's nowadays in problems because we are in the middle of an ecological and climate crisis. And this is also something that I want to stress, the idea that we're not only in a climate crisis, we all know that we are in a climate crisis, but we are also in an ecological crisis, which means that there are other limits of the planet that we are surpassing now, and that we are harming the planet, not only in what regards climate, but also in what regards biodiversity, in what regards the balance of chemicals in the sea and the land, the soils that are useful for agriculture or not. So we have a number of problems that we have to overcome as society as a whole. It's not something that Chile alone can overcome, but it's something in which every country has to do its part. The second pillar of the new Ecological Constitution are principles and duties, mainly duties of the state, as we will see in a couple of minutes. The third pillar is the idea of recognizing the limits of nature. The idea of recognize that nature has limits and that our activities have to respect those limits, that we cannot destroy nature to do our activities, and this is connected with the idea that nature has an inherent value, but also connected with the idea that we have to respect future generations and their possibilities to develop in a world that it's actually usable. No, it's a living world. The fourth pillar are environmental human rights, and this is the only thing that we have nowadays in the Constitution of Chile, in the 1980s Constitution. We have one human right that is similar to the right to a healthy environment. It's not the same one. In the new Constitution, we have the right to a healthy environment and a number of other rights that are connected with the right to a healthy environment. Probably David will speak more about this connection, but I will show you which are these rights. And the fifth and last pillar is the redistribution of power and the new environmental organisms. And the idea of redistribution of power is the idea that the decisions that are connected with the environment will nowadays are taken mostly in a centralized and hierarchical way. And with the new Constitution, what we are seeing is that those decisions will be taken in different spaces that will respect the interests and ideals of the different territories, the different regions of Chile, and also that there is a specific organism, which is the environmental defender, that will balance the power of the state in environmental issues. So working as an ombudsman or ombudsperson, but in environmental matters in a way that can prevent the abuse of power of governments in environmental issues, at least. So all this structure, it's a new structure, even if it uses a number of provisions that we can find in other constitutions or other laws. The way that it builds a network of provisions, of articles, of rules. This way, it's I will say completely new, and it's what is newest about it is the idea that this structure has to overcome the climate and ecological crisis. This is probably one of the central points of the new constitution, and it's likely that Michael will talk about it in his presentation. So I will show you now the main articles that contains these pillars, or that are part of these pillars. In what regards the recognition of our relation with nature, and maybe Benjamin or Antonia, if you can put a link to the new constitution in the chat so people can open it if they want, I will appreciate it. Thank you. The link will have the constitution in Spanish, but anyway, there is in this pillar, in the recognition of our relation with nature and the existence of ecological and climate crisis, we have first the idea that Chile is an ecological state. This is something new. It doesn't have I don't know at least any other state that recognizes itself as an ecological state. And probably the idea of this is to contain all the other rules that are related with the protection of the environment on one hand, and on the other hand, the idea is to say that the state has to organize itself and the activities, not only the activities of the state, but the activities of society, in a way that can be compatible with nature. So an ecological state, I will say, it's a state that it's compatible with nature, that can work and exist without destroying the nature in which the state exists, without destroying its territory. And this is based on the idea in the Article 8, which is that individuals and people are interdependent with nature and form with nature an inseparable whole. So we are part of nature. The idea that we are part of nature, even if it's not a new idea, not at all, probably is the first time that it's stated in a constitution. No? The idea that we are something with nature and that we are interdependent with the different elements in nature. In this line, the state has a duty of dealing with the climate and ecological crisis in the territory, and it also has the duty to work with other countries in the international arena to overcome the crisis. So we have to deal with the effects of the crisis here in Chile, but we also have to work with the other because otherwise it's impossible to overcome the crisis. And also in this idea of interdependent relation with other beings, we recognize in Article 131 the animal rights, and especially the right to live a life without harm of animals. In what regards principles, the new constitution basically states principles that are environmental law principles. Progressiveness, precaution, prevention, environmental justice, intergenerational solidarity, and responsibility are principles that we can find in Stockholm 1972, in Rio 1992, and in a number of other pieces of international legislation. So it's not new at all. It's something that for those that are familiar with environmental law, it's very common to use this principle. The only new principle is the just climate action. And the idea of just climate action or fair climate action is the idea that the state has to do mitigation, adaptation, and just transition, these three pillars of these principles. And that fairness, that distribution has to be in the center of the decision that the state is taking to mitigate, to adaptate, and of course to do just transition. And this is new, no? The idea of having this as a principle of constitutional environmental law. And then we have in states duties, we have a number of state duties. Probably this is not all the state duties, but this is a big, some of them, maybe there are two or three more that I didn't put in this slide, but we have here a number of state duties that that will hopefully make Chile ecological again. Make Chile ecological again. That could be a slogan for the new constitution. The duty of the states to zoning, to secure food security and sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, to protect nature for future generations, to limit rights in order to protect the environment, to respect nature rights, to protect the biodiversity, to have a system of protected areas, to manage, reduce, and do valorization of wastes, and to protect some nature spaces that are specifically protected, such as forest, wetlands, glaciers, soil, and so on. In what regards limits of nature, and I will say that this is very important for the structure because it changes a little bit the way that we are dealing with environmental issues. We are used to deal with environmental problems, stating some new duties to the ones that are harming the environment, but without actually looking at the limits of nature. And I would say that this changes that, and we will have to make decisions. We will make decisions now, taking into account limits of nature, especially because of nature's rights, the protection of the existence of nature that comes with nature rights. It's very crucial to understand the limits of nature, and also with the ideas of the natural common goods. And so the idea that these goods are not ours to destroy them, but they are also from future generations, and the idea of public trust, which is Estado custodio in the Spanish translation, but takes the idea of public trust of the United States doctrine about it. And I think that also has this idea of intergenerational protection of the environment. In what regards the fourth pillar, and I will be very fast in this, we have some rights that can be connected with environmental protection: the right to city and territory, the right to food, to water, to a healthy environment, to clean air. Pretty basic, all these, no? The right to have water, air, and a healthy environment, and food is basically the right to survive. And we have the right of access to nature, which is a new right. It has to be regulated by law, so we don't have the details of it. But the idea is that every person has the right to access some environmental spaces and some natural spaces. And why is this? Because basically, if we recognize that these spaces are common, then we should recognize that there is a right to access them, to enjoy them, and to be connected with nature. And the last pillar, it's about the redistribution of power, as I said before, and we have the creation of new organisms, the basin councils and the water national agency, that will change the way that we manage water, which is very important because we have a lot of problems in this area. The idea of the new environmental defender and the environmental ombudsperson. This new environmental defender, as I said before, will counterweight government in environmental decisions. But the new constitution also gives more power to municipalities and regions to decide about their territories and their environments. And environmental courts, that we already have 3 distributed in the territory. With the new constitution, we should have 1 in each region of Chile. Probably they will take more work, more laws into their work. But the idea is to have access to justice, an easier access to justice with environmental courts in every region. And that's it, which is a lot, but it's very good, I think. And now we will have the time to comment it. So without any further thing, I will give the floor to Michael Berger. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ezio, for that overview and presentation. I'd like to begin, I'll be brief. I'd like to say thank you again for the invitation to join this panel. It's an honor to be here with David Boyd, who is, of course, a leading scholar in the area of human rights and the environment, and fills a critical role in his role as special rapporteur, and with Erin Daly, who is one of the leading scholars on environmental constitutionalism worldwide. My own area of focus, as you mentioned at the outset, is on climate change law, as well as environmental law more generally. I just wanted to highlight, I think, a few aspects of the Constitution that jumped out to me in reviewing it and thinking about it and reflecting on your comments, Ezio. The first is I want to underscore how path-breaking the recognition of the nature and extent of the climate crisis and its interdependence and interconnection with the ecological crisis is. This is a major development, potentially, in environmental constitutionalism and in the ways in which the law recognizes the extent of the climate crisis that we're in, and the fact that it's not some standalone remote problem in space and time. It's immediate, it's now, and it's directly connected to the experience of nature, of natural entities, as well as of people. And in that regard, in that last regard, I also just want to underscore the just climate action provisions, which is something that we're starting to see in here in the United States in state level legislation and framework climate laws, and also in other countries where this notion of a just transition and equity in addressing the climate crisis is being brought front and center. I'd like to flag a few things that also are, as you mentioned at the outset, some of these things are not new. These ideas and concepts and principles have been around for some time, but their inclusion in an ecological constitution of this level of articulation is unique, and certainly worth noting. So the one thing I would note is the intergenerational equity and the recognition of our obligation to future generations as a grounding principle of contemporary environmental, social, and ecological governance. The provision of specific rights around environmental justice and indigenous rights. Also, the ways in which this proposed constitution, integrates these key concepts and puts them all in an order where they relate to one another clearly is distinct. And I believe you mentioned that Erin will be talking a bit more about those environmental justice provisions later. The last thing I just want to notice is the prospect of citizen enforcement. There are provisions in this constitution related to the access to information, access to the new courts that you're talking about, establishing the role of the environmental defender. One of the things that I track at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School is global climate change litigation. And what we are seeing in increasing numbers and an increasing range of geographies is that individuals, environmental organizations and NGOs, subnational governments, and even the private sector are taking to court in order to address the rights and obligations of the climate crisis. And so an explicit provision of access to the information necessary to bring the cases and the courts necessary to hear them is an important development, and one that, should the Constitution be adopted, can help ensure its success in implementation, which of course is, once this enormous challenge is met, there's that one to meet as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you again, Ezio, for the chance to address this audience. I'll look forward to the other panelists' presentations and a discussion to follow.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your comment. Now we will give you the floor to Professor David Boyd. David, the floor is yours.
Vale, muchas gracias, Ezio. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you here today. And I'd also like to start by congratulating the citizens of Chile who participated in the Constitutional Assembly for coming up with this remarkable document. In my role as a professor and a UN Special Rapporteur, I have read the constitutions of over 200 countries around the world. And I can say with great certainty that this is one of the two most detailed from an ecological perspective, the other one being Ecuador's 2008 constitution. I haven't had a chance to count the articles in the Ecuadorian constitution to compare which constitution has more, but to be one of the two most progressive, most ecological constitutions in the world is pretty impressive. And so I'd like to start off with that observation. Ezio, you mentioned this being perhaps the first constitution in the world to create an ecological state. I think it's interesting to note that 3 years ago, China amended its constitution and put the concept of an ecological civilization into the preamble. But the Chinese constitution has nowhere near the depth of human rights and other transformative provisions that this proposed constitution has. I think one of the things we talk about globally is the need to redirect society, right? We have been locked in this structure of pursuing endless economic growth, measuring progress based on increases in the gross domestic product. And I think one of the powerful aspects of this Chilean constitution is that it really refocuses our aim on something which is captured in Article 8, talking about buen vivir, or a good life in harmony with nature. That, I think, is a really radical transformative shift in the overall direction of a society. Of course, this constitution, Ezio's presentation went through much of the information that I was going to talk about today, and so I'll just kind of try to summarize my reflections on this. The United Nations has recently recognized for the first time that everyone has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And so it really, from my vantage point, fantastic to see the depth of the human rights provisions in this constitution related to the environment, related to nature. So as you mentioned, there's the right to a healthy and ecologically balanced environment. There's also the following article speaks specifically of the right to clean air. There are rights related to access to nature, also rights to clean water and sanitation. And so those are actually all substantive elements of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And so that includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and a safe climate. So that's all part and parcel of what this constitution is recognizing. And just to put that in context, that's a dramatic departure from the current Chilean constitution, which talks in Article 19, subparagraph 8, about the right to live in an environment free from contamination, a much narrower conception of an environmental right. And I'll pause there to just emphasize something that Michael just mentioned, which is the implementation side of things. So for decades, the Chilean constitution has recognized this right to live in an environment free from contamination. And yet it will surprise nobody on this webinar that that right has not been respected, protected, and fulfilled. In my most recent report to the UN Human Rights Council, I talked about the concept of environmental injustices, and I highlighted a number of cases from around the world, including the situation of Quintero Puchuncaví in Chile, where for decades, this cluster of industrial facilities has caused immense damage, not just to the environment, but to the health of people living in adjacent communities. And yet it has only been recently that the Supreme Court of Chile has taken action to compel the government to finally address this egregious situation of environmental injustice, harming the most vulnerable amongst us, the children of Quintero Puchuncaví. So I think that it's really critical to say that these words on paper that have been drafted by the Constitutional Assembly are inspiring, they're beautiful, they're compelling, but ultimately there has to be implementation. And so I want to expand on what Ezio was talking about in terms of the institutions, because I think this is absolutely critical. The fact that there is an ombudsperson for nature's rights and for environmental rights, that's an important institution. The fact that there will be specialized environmental courts in each region of Chile, also critically important. And also there's something that Ezio didn't mention, but which is unique to Latin American constitutions, which is the establishment of what's really like a fourth branch of government after the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, which is something called the Ministerio Público, or the public ministry, which is responsible for the protection and the enforcement of human rights right across the country. And so, of course, in a country that would have such strong environmental rights, the Ministerio Público, which is independent from those other branches of government, has a really critical role to play. So that's another institution. There's also a new institution to oversee the management of water in Chile. And this is, again, such a dramatic departure from the existing Chilean constitution, which only refers briefly to water and refers to it as a type of property that is subject to individual ownership. That conception of water is completely replaced in the new constitution by recognition that water is fundamental to life, human life, and all other forms of life, and that water is subject to it's a type of commons subject to a public trust obligation for government. So that's really a critical transformation in one of the most important areas that Chile faces substantial challenges today. Chile is now, if this referendum is in fact adopted in the fall, will be the second country in the world to recognize that nature has rights in its constitution after Ecuador in 2008. And this is part of just kind of the reconfiguration of our relationship with the natural world. I love the provision in this draft constitution that talks about the fact that humans are part of nature. We're not separate from or superior to nature. We are really intimately interconnected with the rest of the natural world. That's just critically important. There are so many provisions. I love the provisions talking about everyone's right to ecological education as the basis for generating ecological citizens. That's just so critically important. And we haven't talked much about the extensive provisions related to the rights of indigenous peoples, but these are also part and parcel of an ecological constitution. We have so much to learn from the wisdom and the customary legal systems of indigenous peoples, and those rights are strongly protected in this constitution. So there's so much to be talked about when you have so many different provisions in a constitution. But I guess I'll close by just by reiterating the importance of implementation. And I do take note of the fact that in the transitional provisions of this constitution, there is a timeline for creating a commission for the ecological transition. That commission has to be established within a year of the constitution coming into force. That's going to be critically important to move that agenda forward as quickly as possible, because while the Constitution sets the framework, there is a lot of heavy lifting yet to be done in terms of laws, regulations, and policies, and then the actual implementation on the ground of those legal provisions. So in conclusion, I'd like to just quote one of my favorite quotes from a South African judge who said that a constitution is like a mirror of a country's soul. And so if this proposed constitution is a mirror of the Chilean soul, then what a beautiful soul that is. Thank you very much, and really looking forward to our conversation.
Many, many thanks, David. We will see if the soul of the country actually is reflected here. But I think it is, and I actually think that our soul as a country is very ecological, but it's a soul that values territory, that values life, and I hope it will stay that way. Thank you, David, very much. And now we have with us Professor Erin Daly. As I said before, she's a leading scholar on environmental constitutionalism, and she's a professor in Delaware Law School, Delaware University Law School, the clinic, and she's the director of the Environmental Law Program. Erin, many thanks to be here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure. It's really an honor to be here with you. And I apologize for coming in late. I had another obligation that I had to do. I also just want to correct the record. I'm not the director of the environmental program at Delaware Law School, but I am the director of the Dignity Rights Clinic. And much of my work is really sort of at the confluence of human dignity and human rights on the one hand, and ecological issues on the other hand. And that's the lens that I'll use just to sort of frame the comments that I have about this Constitution. This is, and I just want to say, David, those were wonderful closing words, and I think it's just a wonderful way to think about when we talk about a constitution, what is it really trying to do? And it really is trying to reflect the things that are most important and most valued in a country. And while I understand why there's sort of an impulse to call this an ecological constitution, in my view, it's actually so much more than that. Because as David said, but and I think as Ezio said, the ecological issues are just so completely imbricated and integrated in with the social issues. And that's, to my mind, what's really wonderful about this also. So let me just mention a couple of things that have sort of jumped out at me about what this constitution is trying to do. The main word that I would use for it is that it is trying to be transformative, right? It is trying to move Chile from where we are now to some more, some place that is aspirational. It's founded in a realistic assessment of the moment and in recognition of the actual challenges and obstacles that we are faced with now: climate change, poverty, violence against people with vulnerabilities. And also with attention to how people really live. There are some wonderful provisions in here in a section about language, and Spanish being the official language and indigenous languages also being recognized in their territories, but also a provision about sign language as an official language within Chile. A recognition of families in all their diverse forms, not limiting families to any one definition, but sort of acknowledging that people live in all kinds of different combinations. And again, a concern about violence that is sort of reiterated throughout the Constitution in a lot of different ways, and obviously sort of eradicating it. There's also, we see in this, a very, very strong belief in the state and its abilities to fix problems, to promote well-being, to promote the full development of the personality, to address things like the balance of work versus leisure time, to inculcate participation in decision-making, and to address very specific things. While it's aspirational and there's these sort of grand visions, there's also some very specific provisions in here about bioethics, about public libraries, about the night sky, about the maldistribution of domestic care, these very specific things that they're talking about, and sort of saying these are issues we need to deal with, and the state is going to deal with them. And so this transformative agenda is built on, in my view, sort of three basic premises. One is the notion of inclusivity, which I know Ezio talked about. Another is, again, this very strong role for the state. And then the third is this particular conception of well-being that's oriented towards social justice and also in harmony with nature, almost just as one thought, right? One indivisible thought. So first, inclusivity. This is a truly extraordinary document in terms of its inclusivity. It's based on the notion that people are born and have that they're born and they remain free, interdependent, and free and equal in dignity and rights. And also recognizing personal rights specifically to a healthy and balanced environment, to clean air, and to other things like that. There is attention to formal inclusion, of course, to the commitment to gender parity, and also to the recognition of people who are neurodiverse and gender non-conforming. So socially, politically, legally, inclusive in those kinds of ways, inclusive people of all ages, provisions about children, provisions about elderly people, and also, of course, about the rights of nature. And it envisions not just a formal inclusivity, but also one that is based on substantive equality and one that is based on the idea of active participation. So it's not just a matter of saying, yes, we respect everybody, but of provisions that ensure that everybody can, in fact, participate. There's a provision in here about children's rights to be heard and to participate in and influence all matters that affect them. That's just wonderful, and certainly I imagine informed by a lot of the activity that we're seeing by children and youth in the climate change context. Obviously, attention to including indigenous groups. David mentioned education, and yeah, there's provisions about environmental educations that are very detailed and robust. Also, different kinds of education to ensure inclusivity of all kinds, digital education, and maybe this, I just haven't seen it in other constitutions, but I don't think I've ever seen a constitution that protects sex education as part of what's important and what people should know if they're going to be full adults in the community. The definition of education is so broad. It says the purpose of education is the creation of the common good, social justice, respect for human and nature's rights. Again, just one integrated thought. Environmental conscience, communal democracy among people, and the prevention of violence and discrimination, among other things. So this very specific but broad conception of what education does in a public community that supports education. Secondly, a very strong role for the state, but always bounded by human rights and dignity. So the Constitution says clearly that the state is founded on the principle of constitutional supremacy and the respect for human rights. And that these precepts obligate all branches of governments, all governments and institutions and groups. So this notion that no matter what we do, we go forward in the context of human rights. We see, it was mentioned before about institutions, nature defender institutions, and also institutions to deal with other kinds of social problems. I'm not quite sure of the exact translation for this, but an integrated system to look at caring and how people need to be able to care for each other, and not just saying that as sort of a social value or even as a constitutional value, but as something that the state is going to address, create an institution and develop regulations and develop sort of law, I assume in kind of a very broad sense of the term, to advance caring, because that's part of what it means to live in a human rights community. I mentioned before specific problems that the Constitution, the draft Constitution says that the government is going to address the maldistribution of domestic work, violence in all different forms against children, gender-based violence, online violence, violence and harms against the environment as well. And I won't go more into the different ways that the Constitution says that the government will address nature and climate change and environment. I think Michael and David and others have done that. What's interesting here is also this very integrated way of saying that the state will really use all the tools that are available to it to address these issues. In some places talking about negative rights, the things that the state cannot do, particularly in terms of like the rights of criminal defendants and things like that, but also positive obligations, an obligation for progressive realization, but also a non-retrogression principle, not just with respect to the environment, but with respect to rights in general. That, and this, I have to confess, struck a chord as an American dealing with some of the recent Supreme Court cases that we've seen in recent weeks. But the idea of non-retrogression, that rights and human dignity are forward-looking. You're always trying to gain more and more dignity-based rights. So what all of this together sort of manifests is a very strong commitment to social justice in harmony with nature, which is understood as an interdependence between people and nature that forms this inseparable bond. Buen vivir is a harmonious relation of equilibrium among people, nature, and the organs of society. The aim is always towards social justice in this context of being sort of in harmony, in equilibrium with nature. So I'll leave it there. And I just want to congratulate the people of Chile and really wish you well with this, because it really is such an ambitious document. And I think that some of the state-based provisions give hope that the state is thinking very much about the implementation question. These aren't just general aspirations, but they are meant to be concretized and implemented. So thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Professor Daly. I like the Constitution even more now that I hear what you think about it. It's amazing. We will have now. We have like 20 minutes for questions and answers. 25 minutes. So we have quite a time. If you want to post questions, as I said before, there's a button that says preguntas y respuestas. You can put there your questions and we will start. Si comunicaciones, si pueden ponernos a los cuatro en la pantalla, se los agradezco. Well, we have the first, thank you, there's Michael and David will come. We have the first question is from Javiera Gracia Magallón, and she asks to David if you believe that the article that says law can limit other rights to protect the environment could clash with state obligations such as guaranteeing access to water. David?
Yes, thank you. This is a good question. Muchas gracias, Javiera, for the question. And I think the question is actually answered by a specific provision in the draft constitution, which, if I can just pull it up here, Article 140 says that water is essential for life and the exercise of human rights and the exercise of human rights and nature's rights. The state must protect water in all of its various aspects and the hydrological cycle. And then subparagraph 2 says that the human right to water, sanitation, and ecological equilibrium must always prevail. So it's kind of saying that that's the top priority, and then the law will determine other uses. So it's making clear that that is the overarching priority in terms of water, that it must fulfill human rights and nature rights.
Many thanks, David. Anyone wants to add something to what David just said, or okay? Here we go with the second question is we will take this question, and I think that Erin can take it. Sonkrant Bonjun asks, I want to learn more about the role of civil society in enforcing environmental rights recognized in the draft. Are there specific provisions about citizens' role in enforcing these wonderful environmental provisions? How do speakers think about the effective ways to implement these new rights? I think that you three can answer a different part of this question. So we will start with Erin and then Michael and David.
I would answer it in two ways, and I might very well have missed things, so I'm sure there's more to say about this. One is just that, in general, this commitment to inclusivity suggests an openness so that if one wanted to make a claim down the line about a right to participate that wasn't specifically spelled out in the Constitution, I think one would have a good claim that participation is envisioned in very broad terms. So I do think there is that. I think there's also some very specific provisions about inclusion of Indigenous groups and participation of Indigenous groups and right to information associated with that participation. And again, I would just mention the provision that says that children have a right to be heard on matter and to have a voice in matters that affect them. I would certainly counsel lawyers to use that to sort of argue for access to information and to rights of participation in environmental matters.
So, like Erin, I will sort of give my response with a caveat, which is there may well be more in this Constitution, that there is a lot, but two provisions jumped out to me in terms of specifically providing for, in the one instance explicitly, and the other maybe implicitly, rights to the courts for citizen enforcement. The first is in Article 443, or Section 443, Constitutional Protection Actions. The provision says quite explicitly that any person that by reason of an act or omission suffers a threat, disturbance, or deprivation in the lawful exercise of their fundamental rights may by himself, herself, itself, or anyone on his, her, its behalf resort to and appear before the court of instance, and it goes on from there. So we have an explicit sort of citizens' rights to courts provision that provides for enforcement of these constitutional rights, which is a very powerful thing. Because as I said during the presentation, I think much of the implementation challenge relies on broad politics, but to some degree, it also will rely on individuals and organizations going to court to seek implementation where government and private sector actors may fall short. The other provision that may more implicitly call to this is provide for this is the section on environmental justice 384 and the provision there on environmental courts. It's sort of phrased in more of a passive, at least in the translation that I was limited to reading, but it says that actions to challenge the legality of administrative acts may be brought directly before the environmental courts. And I would, as a lawyer, if I was reading into that, I would say, well, they may be brought, which means we can bring them.
And I guess I would add, in addition to the constitutional action that was described by Michael, there is also in Article 108 a type of action called la tutela, which is a type of legal action that citizens can use to enforce their constitutional rights. And that's a very important provision in terms of access to justice. I also think more broadly that civil society has a huge role to play, not just in enforcing rights once there's been a violation or an imminent threat, but in pushing governments of all levels to enact the necessary laws, regulations, policies, programs, and plans that will actually deliver on the promise of this Constitution. So that is to instead of waiting until things have gone wrong, to actually take proactive steps to ensure that the necessary legal structures are in place to deliver on the very multifaceted promises that are made in this Constitution. So, that's and that connects into some of the things that Erin was talking about participation and inclusivity. Like, there's going to be a huge job ahead to transform the body of environmental laws in Chile to bring them into compliance with the new Constitution. And so that is a massive effort where civil society will have an invaluable role to play, along with, indigenous peoples and others. So I think it's really important. As lawyers, we tend to default to litigation as the solution to things, but I think it's actually far more important to try and get things right at the front end in terms of the laws and the institutions.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Erin. I like your phone ring. It's like a vintage ringing of the phone, and I like it. We have a number of questions. I will read a couple of them, and we will do another round of answers. I think that this question is very important. Do you see any negative aspects about the Environmental Constitution, and what do you think are the main challenges? This is for the three of you, of course. Then there is a question for Michael from Matías Desmandril. It says, Michael, in your opinion, it is compatible or incompatible, the property rights regarding, for example, water rights, to the duty of custody of the state and natural protection? The idea that we nowadays we have property rights over over water, over the rights to use water, property rights over those. So what Matías is asking, if this is in the 1980s Constitution, but the new Constitution do not have that. If you see that there is a clash between property rights and the protection of nature and water, or if this is compatible, and how? I'm trying to, Matías, if I make any mistake, you can tell me. But I think that was the idea of the question. Then Vicente Diaz, also for Michael, he asked, do you think this model of climate action that the draft includes should be replicated by other countries? Interesting. Jose Ramirez, this is also, I think, very interesting. One of my big concerns is that the world is like a big machine where the biggest countries move the entire world. This ecological constitution could be the best thing for our society, but if the biggest countries do not accompany us, we can be totally isolated. Do you think that in the world, different countries and international institutions are with us in this massive change? Do you think that the world is moving for these kind of changes? That's and I will stop there because we have other questions, but we will do a last round afterwards. So, Erin, if you want to start maybe with what do you see as problems?
I'm not inclined to identify problems in the sense that I think a constitution doesn't necessarily, it can't answer all the questions. It can't answer all the issues. You adopt a constitution at one point, and then you play it out and you implement it and you live with it, and you see how the institutions advance it. So I think that if there are concerns, to me, they're more likely to be worked out in the implementation. And I will just say, I would love to see other countries adopt it, a constitution with many of these provisions.
Thank you, Erin. Michael.
Great. Well, I guess I'll start with Erin's last point there. Yeah, I think that this is a real question when it comes not just to innovative and important constitutions like this, but with climate policies kind of across the board, where people, communities, governments are innovating at a policy level, at a governance level, constitutional level, to come up with new ways to address the scale and scope of the climate crisis. I think that an event like this, where information is shared and conversation is had and a discussion is put out there, is very important to other countries and other actors making their own determination as to whether or not this is the right way to go. So I agree with Erin. I think that there is much in the climate provisions, ecological provisions, and other rights provisions in this constitution that other countries would do well to adopt. But more importantly, perhaps, there's a lot for other countries to digest and other actors to digest and figure out how that incorporates into their own system and into their own, the expression of their national soul that will be reflected in their own constitution or laws. On the water rights question, I'll confess I am not a water law scholar, and certainly not in Chilean water law, to the extent that I know property rights as they pertain to water law. It's in the eastern United States and the western United States. But as a more general matter, I guess I would say that the problem probably isn't necessarily with the rights-based regime so much as in the implementation of the rights in relationship to the commons problem. That is to say, there are ways of managing rights-based property regimes to address commons problems. I think that they raise unique and distinct types of problems, and it requires a level of coordination and operation through many individual property rights owners. That certainly complicates things, but that's not to say that it's impossible. It does seem to me that this shift in the new constitution will likely make it a lot easier to address the water crises confronting Chile moving forward. And then I'll close by just addressing this question about the sort of global trajectory, and what's the question that I think it raised two distinct questions for me. One is, are other countries tending towards or trending towards adoption of ambitious climate and rights-based policies? I'm not going to say constitutions because not everybody is rewriting their constitution, but just what is that global trajectory? And then the concern that of anti-competitive effects, right? Are we hurting our own national interests, our own individuals, our own residents and citizens by virtue of being out ahead of the curve when it comes to something that might seem to be economically non-competitive or inhibiting in some way? On the global trajectory part of that, I would say, yes. I mean, we have countries around the world submitting their nationally determined contributions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as part of their commitments to the Paris Agreement. And those commitments are ratcheting up in ambition as time goes on, not without flaws, not without gaps, either in word and certainly in deed. In terms of actual implementation, there are many gaps. So in terms of ambition, perhaps this is consistent with the general trend, but far out ahead. It's a leader. And that's an important place, I think, to be, because we need continued increased ambition. We need continued leadership from visible countries like Chile. And that's what's going to continue to drive the global community towards addressing the climate crisis, even as major contributors like the United States step backwards with decisions, with actions and decisions like last week's decision from the United States Supreme Court. In terms of the anti-competitive effects, I fall into the camp of believing that, you know, anything that's anti-competitive that can or puts one at an economic disadvantage by virtue of seeking to address the global climate crisis is a risk worth taking. There is no long-term economic success in the face of the climate crisis for the vast majority of us. And so, you know, there are short-term sacrifices and there are short-term compromises that need to be made. And in addition, there are economic advantages and financial advantages to being out ahead of the curve. There certainly is a lot of economic opportunity in climate action, and a constitution like this may well put Chile in a position to capitalize on that.
Many thanks, David. Michael, sorry. David, your floor.
Thank you, Ezio. And just wish to start by expressing my agreement with many of the comments that Erin and Michael have made. I think in terms of, are there negative aspects about having an ecological constitution? I think Michael has touched on some of the economic challenges that may arise. And I think that's one place where you may see conflicts arising is, you know, you've got major industries, whether it's industrial agriculture, fossil fuel companies, mining companies that are not going to be pleased with the provisions in this constitution, right? They will be pushing back. I'm sure they're already pushing back against in terms of the referendum, and they will push back against the implementation as well. And I think, you know, we live in a globalized economy where there are international trade agreements that actually make it very difficult for governments to take some of the steps that will be necessary to implement the environmental provisions in this constitution. So I think that's part of the challenge is that you're going to need a series of governments over a period of time in Chile that are willing to really stand their ground and fight back against these vested interests that are opposed to the implementation of the ecological constitution. And certainly, you know, there will be, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can forecast there will be investor state arbitration cases brought against Chile if the government of Chile does follow through with these ambitious transformative changes. And it will be up to the government of Chile to relentlessly defend those challenges, using the constitution to justify its actions. And I think the government of Chile and the people of Chile can take some comfort in the fact that another leader, Costa Rica, has been quite successful in defending itself against these types of investor state actions and has used its constitutional right to an ecologically and healthy and ecologically balanced environment as a rationale for taking actions that justify limits on corporate activity in that country. So I think that's an important thing to be aware of. The other challenge, and I think it's important to be frank about this, is that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, Ecuador has, prior to this Chilean constitution, Ecuador's constitution is the most robust and detailed in terms of its environmental provisions. It's now 14 years old, and Ecuador has struggled with the implementation of that ambitious constitution, has struggled to implement the rights of nature, has struggled to implement the transformative changes in terms of the management of the commons. And so I think that is actually a warning sign to Chile that this is a very important first step, but there is a tremendous amount of work that lies ahead in terms of transforming these inspiring words on paper into practical actions that will affect the day-to-day lives of the people of Chile. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. I will also say that, you know, in terms of the question about, is this a model for other countries? In some ways, yes. Certainly the provisions are incredibly progressive, as we've all been saying. But there are different constitutional models. You know, Costa Rica, you look at as one of the most successful and leaders in terms of the green transition, with, you know, an incredible record in terms of 99% of their energy comes from renewables, 30% of their land protected in national parks, laws to prevent open pit mining, laws to prevent offshore oil and gas development. Costa Rica has one short provision in its constitution about the environment, which says everyone has the right to a healthy and ecologically balanced environment, and the government has a duty to protect that right. They don't have any of these detailed provisions, but Costa Rica has harnessed that one concise provision to bring about a complete transformation of Costa Rican society over the past 30 years. So there's different models that are going to work in different places, but it's clear to me that this is a constitution made in Chile by the people of Chile for the future of Chile, and that's as it should be. And so to the extent that other countries around the world, people like us, can support the Chilean endeavor, can support this to be successful in the referendum, can support the implementation, I think I can speak for Michael and Erin that we stand ready to do everything in our limited power to support the people of Chile in this auspicious effort.
And we really appreciate it, David and Michael and Erin. Thank you very much. We will do the last round of questions, and you can also do your closing remarks if you want. We have a couple of questions about nature's rights and how the nature's rights in the new Constitution of Chile are different from those in the Constitution of Ecuador or not. And I think that David already covered part of this, but maybe speak a little bit about the difficulties in the implementation in Ecuador could be helpful. There are also a couple of questions regarding economic challenges, and there is especially one that I think it's interesting, who says that it asks if an anonymous assistant, do you see any risk for long-term investment behind agriculture, mining, forest activity, or green hydrogen production, considering that the water usage at the water permits are considering two things. One, that the water permits could be revocable, and the second thing is that originary nations need to consent for activities in their territories. That's the question. And there is another question related with that that says we need mining done sustainable. Maybe it's from the same person, but we need mining done sustainable to fight climate change and decarbonize the global economy. And some say that there is a veto from that could be a veto from originary people, indigenous people, and this can provoke uncertainty about etc. But the idea of how we do mining and other activities in indigenous land now that the new constitution has this provision about their rights. That's the idea that I want you to comment. Camila Torralvo asked if what aspects of this document in environmental matters do you consider the most important one to incorporate in other constitutions in the future? Lorena Cristina, nature's right. Okay, yeah, I think that's it. So we will start with Erin again. If you want to ask to answer any of these questions, or you do a final remark, or do both, whatever suits you. We are free people in a free webinar. So, Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't have that much to say about these. I think Michael and David probably know a lot more than I do about some of these answers. The only thing I'll mention about the rights of nature in comparison to the Ecuador example is that, one of the things that I like about this constitution, and I understand David saying there's other ways to get to a good end. It doesn't have to be this comprehensive. But in this constitution, where they've chosen to sort of address things in these very comprehensive, but then also scaffolding and interlocking ways, that makes me sort of feel like there's a coalescing vision of social and environmental justice that's being advanced, and that rights of nature is part of that. And I think that one of the things that Chile has the advantage of, which Ecuador didn't in 2008, is the Ecuadorian jurisprudence. And I see in the Constitution some uses of the language that copy very much what Ecuador put in its constitution, and then other things that make me think that they actually, that they looked at some of the cases and the development since then and have grown from that. So I think that's useful as well. And there's obviously rights of nature jurisprudence from other countries as well, but the Ecuadorian model is probably the most useful for them. So I'll just mention that I think that there's an integration there. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Sure. So I think I'll respond very briefly to this issue of the local veto. I think it's a very complex question, and it raises foundational issues of indigenous people's rights and community rights that are beyond the scope of these sort of closing remarks, at least from where I stand. But I think that question is related to the first question you asked, which all leads me to this sort of concluding remark, which is that the Constitution as drafted does not answer all of the questions that are going to arise in the course of implementation. To echo a point that Erin and David have made earlier, this is not designed to sort of address every concern. Certainly, the energy transition requires critical minerals for its enactment. This Constitution doesn't say how to make those trade-offs, who's going to win and lose, how the benefits and costs are going to be allocated. There are hard decisions that will need to be made, and not everything is going to be an ideal sort of set of outcomes from here on out. But all that being said, the Constitution articulates an essential set of principles, a guide, a framework through which to begin to resolve these complex issues, and imbues individuals with the right and a set of rights to protect, things that are fundamental to their individual realities, as well as to the national reality. So I don't see this Constitution as the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new story about how the nation will be moving forward to deal with the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and the human rights crisis moving forward.
Thank you, Michael. David.
Yeah, just a quick response on the question about the rights of nature. I agree with what Erin said. Also, I think that on paper, the provisions of the two constitutions related to the rights of nature have a lot of similarities. But I think where Chile has an advantage over Ecuador is there's two areas. One is the Constitution, this proposed Constitution establishes a number of institutions that will be critical in enforcing and protecting the rights of nature. And the second piece, which is actually fundamental to every single element of the Constitution, is the rule of law in Chile is stronger. Chile has a robust democracy, not perfect in terms of corruption, but strong government institutions. And that rule of law is the kind of the underlying foundation that's absolutely essential to the successful implementation of any and all of these constitutional provisions we're talking about. In countries with weak rule of law, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or North Korea, they have beautiful words in their constitutions, but there's absolutely no connection between those papers and the reality of people's lives on the ground. So I think that rule of law issue is critically important. And then just to close, I would come back to what we started this conversation with. We are living in an unprecedented global environmental crisis. The climate emergency, the collapse of nature and biodiversity, pervasive pollution that's killing more people every year than the COVID-19 pandemic. For God's sake, come on, let's be aware of the magnitude of this crisis, the urgency of this crisis. And this Chilean constitution, in my view, represents an eminently appropriate and inspiring response to the most critical crisis that humanity has ever faced. And so that's why this is such a powerful document. That's why this is such an exciting initiative. And this is why this is an issue of leadership, not only for the people of Chile, but for the world. And so I think I'd just like to reiterate my gratitude for this visionary document.
And I want to express my gratitude to you three for being here, for your comments, for everything that you said. I think that was a very interesting event, and I'm really grateful that you took the time to read the new constitution and to comment it. I know we don't have that much time, so I really appreciate your effort, your company, and the things that you have been saying during this seminar. I want to thank you all the people that are watching us for being here. I want to invite you again to read our environmental law journal, where you can read and submit articles in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. In the chat, you can find the links to go to the journal, and we are welcoming papers from everyone who wants to publish environmental law new papers. So many thanks again, David, Erin, Michael. Hope to see you soon, and thank you, everyone.
Muchas gracias, Ezio. Cuídate todos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.